Welcome, everybody. Tonight we're working on Unit 8. The topic for the evening is functions in MySQL. I am going to transport us over to the W3 School site to take a look at how they describe functions, and then we'll also take a look at the MySQL tutorial site before we switch modes and get into the exercises. So I do have the functions tab over here in my Brave browser, and I run that one once again because it does a whole bunch of blocking. And I just want you to notice W3 Schools is a great site, but they blocked 10 trackers for me already, and most of the ads that will appear on the screen. So I'm a huge fan, especially when I'm doing videos like this. There's no reason for me to double advertise for somebody. All right, so functions are basically a way in MySQL to perform a task or an action using, in essence, what we call sort of like a application programming interface, which means pre-built code that performs that specific action. Now, we've been using some of this stuff already, but we haven't really talked about what functions are. But generally, whenever we're, let's say, writing a function, and I'm going to go into like text mode here. And remember last week we were using the cast function, and the way that you do it is like you use the keyword and then you put parentheses after it. And just like in regular coding, so if you guys have taken the Python class already, or even the Java class or any other like programming class, in most programming languages, we create blocks of code, give them a name, and then by calling that name, so this would be the name of it, cast would be the name, followed by a set of parentheses, that implies that we're calling a function to operate, and all the statements inside that code will execute, right? Now, we don't get to see what's inside these functions because we don't create them, but we know what they do, right? So that's really kind of the point of it, right? And the cast function, for example, allowed us basically to take a data type and either use a portion of it or change it to a different data type to suit our needs for output. That's what that one did. If you also remember, we've done other ones like round or max or something like that. Those are ones that we've used, and those are pretty intuitive what they actually perform as you're doing them. But whenever you're in a coding language, and SQL is not an exception here, whenever you see a word followed by a set of parentheses, it implies a function that you're triggering. The parentheses sometimes can be empty, sometimes require what we call arguments or parameters. So that's the stuff that we put inside, the information that's required to make the function do what it does. So, for example, if I was rounding a number, it has to have a number to round, right? So I can't just say round. What am I rounding, right? Maybe the cost of a product might be something it's rounding. And then depending on how the function operates, it might require, like I said, no parameters. That's the stuff that goes inside here, or a couple of parameters, usually separated by commas, or maybe many parameters. And the parameters can be numeric, they can be text, and sometimes other things such as Boolean values, for example. Now, we've learned some basic functions already, but as you'll see here on W3 Schools, and I'm going to kind of go back to regular mouse mode, they have functions in a bunch of different categories. And you'll notice that they have functions that are built for strings. I'm going to scroll here. Functions that are built for working with numbers. Functions that work with dates. Ones they call advanced that do weird things. And cast is one of those, by the way. And that covers, I'm not going to say this covers all the functions that are available in this language, but it covers all the significant and important ones that you're likely to actually use, right? Now, here's the thing. All right, so you look at this list, and you guys should be thankful because I'm not going to like test you on like, okay, which function does this and which function does that, and you have to memorize it. Here's the thing in programming. forget memorizing stuff. Instead, your mindset is how quickly and where do I look it up to figure out what it does? W3 Schools, by the way, is excellent for exactly that type of thing. I think of this as a reference site. It's also a learning site, but mostly it's a reference. Now, I could also go to the MySQL, I think it's .org site, right? And this is run by Oracle, by the way. And they have documentation here as well, right? Where you can look up documentation on, and you can see it goes pretty darn deep, but they have a reference manual here for MySQL. If you really want to dig into the language, I'm just like saying, right? Um, that's very, very deep, right? And here you'll notice some of the functions, and you notice how many more categories they have for functions in really high performance scientific analytic areas. And here's the reality, like chances are if you're going to use any of that stuff, it's because of necessity, right? Not because of common usage. So like, for example, if you were a geoscientist using a GIS system, you would probably use the spatial analysis functions. Or if you're maybe a scientist, a mathematician, or an actuary, you might use precision math or something like that, right? And so they're highly specific, but the complete manuals are here. And this stuff, I'm going to just tell you right up front, the reason I usually don't go here as a reference site, it's not because the information's not the same. So like, for example, they have a quick listing like W3 Schools does, but you can see how much more extensive it is. And then they go in here and they give you very specific examples and talk about the mechanics of it and all that stuff, right? And which may or may not be helpful. I find the interface a little bit more clunky, but when you're looking for the more obscure functions, you'll probably have to come here to do the research. And in principle, this should be probably amongst the best information because this comes from the people that create the product, which is Oracle. And remember, this is like the free version of Oracle in essence. All right. Coming back here, let's just kind of like rifle through these basic categories and talk about some of these functions and how they operate. We can look, for example, at ones that we've already used to kind of maybe trigger our memory as to like, oh, okay, this is something I sort of remember, right? But let's look at a couple of basic ones. Well, let's look at concat, right? And this one, of course, is to concatenate text. And what this one does, and notice, is it takes strings that they're inside double quotes. It separates each string with a comma, right? And as you run that statement, what it's going to do is it's going to join the strings together into one string. Okay, not super exciting, but it shows you what it does. Now, in this case, we're hard coding strings into it, but we could be selecting a record and using, for example, first name, and then putting in a character, that kind of thing, or inserting punctuation or whatever is necessary to make it look better on the screen, right? And so concat's just a very basic example. As we kind of go back here, I just wanted you to look at some of the stuff that's available, right? So here's kind of an interesting one: format, right? So if you guys ever wondered, like, okay, so I'm doing a calculation, right? And my calculation comes up with this number and it goes into the database, but I want to display it in a way that's a little bit more user friendly in a format that we're used to, right? So think about, like, when we look at numbers, we're taught from a very early age. If I'm like typing a number, let's say like 1,234,000 567.09, and we put in these symbols here because it's more comfortable for our eyes to have it there, because then we can tell what number it is a lot better than if it was this, or if it was this, with like a bunch of characters at the end, right? And boy, it's not typing, is it? Oh, my num lock is off, no wonder. All right, something like that. Right. So the whole point of the format command is that it allows you to put it into that format that we are comfortable looking at, right? So you take this weird number here, and as you run the code, it now formats it in that comfortable thing. And it also, right, um, trims off the last two characters. How? Well, the second parameter here is saying we only want to see two decimal places. So that, is one of those things, right? So how many decimal places are typical for money? Two decimal places, right? The commas just make it easier for us as humans to read it. And yeah, you can make this number like huge, right? And if you want to round it to, I don't know, 5 decimal places, you can do that, and it'll do that work for you. Now, typically, this sort of a thing will be for output, right? We don't necessarily want to change the data in the database. We just want to format it on the screen so it's easier to read, right? And then you can also combine functions, which is kind of interesting. So, for example, I could format something and then concatenate a $sign in front of it to make it look like money. Okay, that could be useful in an application, right? Sometimes some of that formatting, and I'll just be real frank about this, would be handled in the application code. Like Sabrina was showing us her code, right, in her program. She could also format it and put a $sign in with Java code instead of in the database. So some of these things, you use with selective insight is a polite way to say it, right? Like, you don't want to typically change the data in the database because you want the accuracy, but putting it on screen, that might be something you want to do, right? Now, you'll notice that some of the things that we look at share names with MySQL commands. And this is the part that I do find a little bit confusing at times, at least when I was learning it, because we have a MySQL command called insert, wherever that is up here, right? Insert into, right? That's why they use two words for it. And then we have an insert command here, which allows us, for example, to take, this stuff here and insert it into a string, right? So just to kind of run that one really quick. What is that doing exactly? Well, we didn't read the documentation on it. This one's a little harder. Like if you just look at what we're starting with and what the output is, what it's telling you here is it's taking something in the first position from the 9th position. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's taking the .com and adding it to example is what it's doing. So it's like taking, yeah. So the syntax is kind of weird. So this is why, real frankly, you end up having to look up what its use is, what the syntax is, and what each parameter is, right? And then what it returns, right? And they tell you like what version it works with. And so this is really kind of a weird one, right? And I'm just randomly picking them here. But there are some that are more important than others and ones that we use pretty often. And some of them we've already used, right? So the whole point here is to kind of expose you to a bunch of the things that are possible with functions. So for example, if I have an application that's running and I ask a user to enter their email address, and this is kind of an interesting one, right? Don't worry, I won't put an email address on the screen because obviously YouTube doesn't like that too much from me, especially if it thinks it's real. But when we use email addresses on systems, some of us will have email addresses that have capital letters in them. Here's the real truth. On email systems, lowercase is the way it goes. So you might use uppercase letters, but they can get converted to lower. So a really common thing to do, like if somebody types in an email address and they put it in all caps, is you use the lower function to convert a string to lowercase. Now this one's a pretty simple one, right? As an example, Let's see. I don't know if my browser's locked up here. Well, isn't that a fascinating effect? I see it. Oh, there we go. I see it scrolling in my Zoom window, but not on my screen. Very interesting. All right. But basically, that takes all the uppercase letters in this string up here and outputs it all lowercase. Now, this isn't really a good example, but if you were getting, once again, an email address from a user from the front end of the form and their caps lock is on, or they think they're using capital letters in the username, you can switch them to all lowercase or uppercase, right? There's functions that do that as well. Some other really interesting ones that we use quite a bit. Here's one called length, where we check to see, well, how long is a person's name, or how long is a string of text, right? And so we can check it maybe before we insert a record, or we can just really do a count because that's really what we want. We just want to count the number of characters. As you kind of like go through these, you can see a bunch of different things. We have upper and lower are ones that we use, spots where we can add spaces to things. We also have these trim commands, which I think are kind of interesting. And let me explain why. A lot of what we do with a database sometimes is handled, frankly, by an external application. So some programmers writing code, like the one that we just saw for Sabrina, where it's got a form, people are typing into it. And often when people fill out forms, and I'm not sure if you guys are like this or not, but it even happens more so on phones, but you go to a form and you fill out the field and you type in, let's say, your name or your email or whatever, and then it, by habit, as we type and then hit the space bar, type, hit the space bar. And on apps, we'll type something in and it'll add a space at the end of something automatically. And we really don't want that. Or people mistakenly put spaces at the front of things or at the back of things, and the left trim will get rid of the spaces in front of a string, and the right trim will get rid of the spaces at the end of a string, so it can go into the database cleanly without the spaces, because it must have been a mistake, right? So you see like the thinking there. And the other aspect of it too is it saves memory, right? So that's another reason why to use this one. All right. So you can explore these functions, and there'll be different use case scenarios for all this stuff, depending on what you're trying to do in, logically within your database or within the program you're writing that's supported by a database. We have a bunch of numeric functions. These we've been using as well. You can see some of these, deal with all sorts of different types of math formulas. One that we've already used quite a bit right from the beginning is count, where it can go to a column of data and count how many records there are. That's very, very useful. We have a bunch of like trig functions. You can see sine, cosine, tangent, etc. You can do absolute values. You can do floor values. You can do mins and max. You can do math functions like modulus, division. You can raise things to a power, right? Notice there's a couple of those. There's also a representation for pi, if you don't remember what the value is. So they have a function for that. That you can do things like sums and square roots, and that's all built in. And just to demonstrate a couple of these, right? Like how you might use it. Like you might have a hard-coded number, right? And you run the square root of it, and the result of this one is obviously 8. But this could also be a field from your table that has a numeric value, and you need the square root of it for some other calculation, and you can perform that with that function, right? That's the point of these. When you look at the actual MySQL reference on math formulas, there are way more than the ones that are listed here, significantly more. And then we also notice that there's all those really highly specific ones that deal with, science or GIS or whatever, right? And so we have numeric functions as well. And once again, situation will dictate which one is useful, right? And if you're looking to do a specific type of action, so let's say truncates a number to the specified number of decimal places. Okay, I could see that. What situation, right? For money is often a calculation, right? Or rounding is one that we've used a few times. And the real typical scenario for that is, rounding to 2 decimal places for financial situations typically, right? Very commonly used. It is possible, and we've done a little bit of this already too, to wrap one function inside of another. So you can, maybe round a number and then take its square root. That's a possibility. All right, let's take a look at some of these date functions. And some of these are kind of interesting because we can use these in a lot of pretty creative ways. So for example, if you want to like grab the current date and add it to your database, this function here will read the system time on your system, assuming it's set correctly, right? So because it can be incorrect. It's much less likely these days. And if I run this, you should see the current date, right? Which is correct. It is July 1st, 2025. And as with many of these, I mean, the names are fairly self-explanatory in the date area, like what they do. So look at what it does and how you might need to use it. And then you can utilize that to your advantage. We've played a little bit with a couple of these, not a lot. But some of the ones that I like to use, real frankly, is the timestamp is a big one. Like if you do a point of sales transaction, I think, or if you are looking for now, right, current date and time, it's kind of the same thing. Basically, some of these kind of like overlap each other a little bit, and they're very useful in a lot of different ways. So, like, what's your need? Try to look up which one would work best. Experiment with a little bit, see what the output is, and then apply that function as needed. There are the ones that fall into advanced areas, and we're not going to really use a lot of these here. Frankly, we have touched upon a couple though, right? So think about cast, right? It converts to a specific data type. That can be useful if you need to do calculations that require either precision or lack of precision, or that type of thing. Here's one that's we played with as well. And I'm just going to kind of review the if one, if you guys recall. But the way that if works is we check a condition, right? Is it true or false? And then the first or the second parameter is what happens if it's true and what happens if it's false, right? And so here they have a statement, and notice, 500 is less than 1,000. That's true. So that would come back from that function. If that was false, the sign was reversed, it would come back with no. And mind you, it doesn't have to be text, it could be numbers. But usually the condition is driven usually either with a logical operator like less than or greater than or equal to or something like that. Or it's a straight up true false value that's driven like is something null, for example. So those are very helpful as well. Lots of different ones down there in the advanced section. One that I also find kind of like weird and curious, right, is like, yeah, they have a function for database. Like if you're a database admin, you don't know what database you're working in, you can write a function to tell you. I think that seems kind of silly to me, but think about if you were a coder and you're connecting to a database and you weren't sure what the name was, or if you had some functional reason to show the name of the database to your user, you would use that function. You can also figure out who the current user is on the database. You can also, do that, or the version number of the database. This one is actually pretty useful because sometimes you have access to the database, the name, the password, and all that stuff, and the tables and everything, but you don't know what version of MySQL it is. Because if you're using an old version of MySQL, there are some different commands that you have to use from the modern version of SQL, right? So that can be helpful. All right, I think that's a fairly decent overview of functions overall. Then we have um, this site here, and I just want to show you the materials that they have, right? Um, oh boy, that doesn't really take us to, all right, down here. All right, so they get into functions, and I think what I like about what they do here, I kind of expected this to go right to this section of the page, is they talk about functions in a different grouping mechanism, right? So they talk about aggregate functions. And so they call those functions that allow you to perform calculation on a set of records and return a single value. So you have a column of numbers and you add them together, or you average them, or you count them, or which is the biggest, which is the smallest. Then you have what we call comparison functions, like which is the biggest, which is the least, which is this null. And think about what that returns, usually a true or false or a specific value. They have functions that control the flow of expressions. Um, so if you do like if statements, for example, one's related to dates, strings, like we talked about. And then we have this one, which is kind of an interesting one. And I'm going to circle back to that one in just a second. And then we'll talk about window functions um, and math functions. The regular expressions is one that is pretty important in the field of coding, because regular expressions are really a way, and this is really a bizarre kind of thing. Regular expressions, I'm not going to call them absolutely universal, but in most programming languages, database systems, um, and heck, just about every programming language I can think of supports regular expressions. And what regular expressions are is a way to provide, I'm trying to put it in sort of like common sense terms, a way to provide a structure for the information in an expected format that you want it to be in. So for example, if I were to type in, and they give examples of emails, right? That's a real common one. What does an email address look like? Well, an email address typically has some letters, maybe even some numbers, an at symbol, some more letters, a dot, and then some more letters. That's the format of an email address. And we can set up a regular expression in the database to make sure that the email is entering in the right format. Why would we want to do that? So that we know that it's correct. So when we try to send an email to that person, it's valid. Right? Basically, that's what it is. So, and then look at some of the other examples they have. Like IP addresses have formats that you follow. Phone numbers have, formats that you follow. Social security numbers, and it says, or anything with a specific pattern of information. Maybe it's a SKU for a product or whatever. Right. And the kind of interesting thing about regular expressions is, and this isn't really the place to learn about them, but I'm looking for an example of a regular expression. Yeah, they really don't. This is not a regular expression library. What they really talk about here is the basic terminology used within SQL to do this. I do not um, push the learning of regular expressions really deep, but um, I'm doing this in Brave. Hopefully I typed that incorrectly. But basically, if you look at this little pattern here, a regular expression, regardless of what language you're coding in, will fall into this pattern. And really what it is, this is your starting character, your terminating character for the regular expression. And what it's really telling us is you can put any lowercase letter, any uppercase letter, any number, and then, I'm not sure what that syntax is right there. And then there's an at symbol, and then there's more letters and numbers, and then there's a dot, and then there's more letters and numbers with a minimum of 2 letters, right? But, and there's a whole syntax that goes with this. The beautiful thing about regular expressions is you really don't have to memorize how to do it. There's lots of examples out there. But if you were to look at the manual for regular expressions, it's like about 4 or 5 inches thick on paper. It's huge. But it is a very powerful mechanism that is cross-language supported. So it works in databases, it works in Java, it works in Python, it works, pick a language, it works in that language, and is often used to make sure that people enter information in the correct pattern so it works either with their app or their database, right? And there is a special library for it in MySQL for handling it. Now, typically, and this is my opinion, mind you, and I don't say this is right or wrong. I would rather see a coder write a regular expression on the front end application, like a Java or Python program, and control the input there rather than write it into the database. But people who are really careful programmers will do it on the application level and the database, right? Why? So that the data in the database is not corrupt, that it's accurate and it's valid and it's in the correct format. Like, how happy would you be if your tax return didn't come back to you because your social security number was missing a dash, that type of thing, right? That's the type of thing we're talking about. All right. What I would encourage you guys to do, right, is as you're coding, you're going to have certain ones you're going to want to do or be told to do. But if you get into situations where it's like, hey, could I do this? See if there's a MySQL function for it. The chances are there probably is. Then if you're working at a higher code level, then you start asking yourself the question, do I want to do it in my programming language, or do I want to do it in my database, or do I want to do it in both? What makes sense? And, people have strong opinions about this, right? But data integrity is important. Regular expressions are a way to enforce data integrity, frankly. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're kind of done with the lecture pieces at this point. I'm just going to go back and make sure I'm not missing anything, and I'm not. We're going to do a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll start digging into the exercises. So it's 6:25. Let's come back at about 6:31-ish. All right, so I'll see you guys in about 5 minutes. Video will pause. All right, I guess we're going to go into exercises now. So this video will end here, and the next video will be the Unit 8 functions exercises for MySQL.